For the Season 2 finale of Fairground Fuck-Ups, we go to Australia's theme park capital, the Gold Coast in Queensland on the eastern seaboard. I'm Holly Mitchell, you're listening to Fairground Fuck-Ups. It could have been avoided. In the end, those were the words that rang loudest in everyone's ears. It could have, should have been avoided. In the words of one of the paramedics who attended the scene and lives forever with the emotional scars of the horror he saw that day, almost a generation of one family has been wiped out. Onlookers were traumatised, loved ones devastated, business owners disgraced. All this and far worse. The tragedy that claimed the lives of 4 Australian holidaymakers on the Queensland Gold Coast was, when all is said and done, a tragedy that was easily preventable. To understand how the incident occurred and all the factors that contributed to the disaster, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to the very beginning, to the origins of what is unquestionably Australia's premier amusement park, to the prevailing culture that guided its construction and operation, and to the dream of an entrepreneur who wanted to bring joy to the whole family. From the very beginning, it may be possible to see how exactly such a terrible tragedy was allowed to happen, and why, years later, very little seems to have changed. The dream belonged to John Longhurst. In 1968, the self-made millionaire took his young family on their own holiday and ended up at the Taronga Park Zoo in Sydney, another of Australia's premier attractions. Leaving the park with his young children in tow that day, however, Longhurst was not impressed. A man possessed not only with an uncanny knack for good business, but an unflappable work ethic, Longhurst considered the paltry display of caged animals and thought quite simply, I could do better. Long fascinated by the American icon Walt Disney, John Longhurst reflected that what Australia needed was something like what the United States had in Disneyland. He was the first to tell others that Australia could never sustain such a grand kingdom as that, having neither the potential nor the population, but something like it, something uniquely Australian that embodied the description of Disneyland that had captured Longhurst's imagination. A real DreamWorld. The first thing he did was copyright the name. The next was to purchase 210 acres of undeveloped land in the booming state of Queensland. Over the next 7 years, Longhurst would attract business partners, recruit international designers and architects, some of who were involved in the creation of Disneyland and Walt Disney World. Not content with riding the desk on the project, Longhurst was out in those fields from the early days, operating excavators, directing work teams, and contributing in a very hands-on way to the realisation of his venture. Working with the essence of Australian culture, Longhurst envisioned a theme park that reflected Australia's colonial roots. Buildings would be constructed in the Victorian pioneer style, while among the first rides were a steam-powered locomotive, still in operation to this day, and a paddle barge to travel the 800-metre river that he had personally spent 2.5 years digging, single-handedly if you believe some accounts. During these years, the Longhurst family watched their father work relentlessly in pursuit of his vision, and at that time, the driving ethos of DreamWorld was simple. It was to be perfect. Longhurst would not tolerate cut corners, and he would make no compromises. Like the American kingdoms from which he drew inspiration, he and everyone employed in the construction would be completely devoted to its integrity. As the park became more and more of a reality, the pride felt by those involved became an almost infectious force throughout the nation. Here, finally, was an authentically Australian experience. Not a copy and pasted funland like Luna Park, or the overly familiar travelling carnival. DreamWorld bore the history and image of a young nation. And while Longhurst may have been too humble to honestly compare his theme park with his inspiration overseas, the media had no problems at all declaring it to be Australia's answer to Disneyland. DreamWorld was the perfect fusion of adventure park and celebration of history. Designed like an old gold mining town where the buildings stood as tourist attractions, Longhurst was canny enough to plan for the most important thing, the potential to grow. Opening in 1981 with just 5 attractions, the surrounding land was marked in segments for future development. Through the 1980s, a new theme section was opened almost every year. This gave the hundreds and thousands of patrons who had been through the gates in that first year to return annually, in order to experience the newest thrills the park was offering. The longest roller coaster in the Southern Hemisphere, water slides and pools for hot days, a chairlift to carry the family over the heads of the people on the ground, offering magnificent views of the countryside, street theatre or film shown in IMAX, a ride underground in mining carts, and of course, the Thunder River Rapids. Each new endeavour was a testament to John Longhurst's standards of perfection, and cemented DreamWorld as the largest and greatest of all parks in Australia. In truth, nothing else could even come close to matching the sheer scale of DreamWorld. Her closest competitor, Australia's Wonderland, 1,000 kilometres away in Sydney, New South Wales, may have outmatched DreamWorld in size, but couldn't come close in terms of content. Wonderland operated for 18 years, closing its gates for the final time in 2004. The tales of mismanagement for that Sydney landmark are a story in itself. But in the end, it only served to highlight the supreme triumph of the Gold Coast's main attraction. For 8 years, Longhurst and his partners thrived, building not just an adventure park, but happy family memories for millions of Australians. His dream finally realised, Longhurst felt there was nothing left to contribute, and in 1989 sold his interest to DreamCo. Though few common punters would have ever realised, it was the end of an era for DreamWorld, not just a parting of ways with the founder, a man who had literally built the place with his own hands, but also the end of the work ethic that drove it for those first years, and the standards that guided its operation. It would take some time to become apparent, but it was the end of the perfect park.